Welcome back. So in this set of lectures, I'm going to be talking through some ideas from James Stuart Mill, also sometimes referred to just as J.S. Mill, who is probably the most well-known utilitarian thinker. He came after Bentham, and Bentham was the founder of the movement, but Mill was probably the most influential member of the movement. And Mill's father was actually a student of Jeremy Bentham, and there's an interesting little biography in the book that Mill was raised in a certain way to be a kind of perfect utilitarian child, and was raised on lots of education, even at an early age, reading the classics and studying the sciences and so on. In his adult life, Mill published on a very wide range of topics, including economics, political theory, logic, including scientific method. There are some methods that Mill developed for inferring causation from correlation that are called Mill's methods, and they're still sometimes taught in courses on logic and on scientific reasoning or scientific method, and also ethics. And so we're reading one of his great books on ethics, probably his most well-known one, called Utilitarianism, and we're just reading chapter 2 from that book. It's also worth noting that Mill published some very influential short writings on contemporary issues, political issues of his time that have also been influential subsequently, including an argument for women's rights, including the right to vote, which he composed largely with the help of some important women in his life, Harriet Taylor and her daughter. The latter is pictured here in this image. He also wrote on freedom of speech and religious toleration. So he has a famous text called On Liberty, which argues for the importance of freedom of speech and other kinds of individual or personal freedoms. And it's still a favorite text that people read and discuss about those issues. So as I mentioned, we're just reading from chapter 2 of his book, Utilitarianism, which I believe is 5 chapters long. It's still a pretty short book. And we're only reading actually selections from chapter 2, just really the first part of chapter 2. So what I'm going to do now is dive into some of that stuff. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit more background and then dive into what he says in that chapter. But first, you might ask, what's he doing in this chapter? What's going on in this chapter? So let me just give you a little bit of that background. Basically, what's happening here in this chapter called What Utilitarianism is that Mill is clarifying what he understands utilitarianism to be. And he actually wants it to be something a little bit different from what Bentham said that it was. So there's almost everything in utilitarianism, in Mill's utilitarianism, is in agreement with Bentham. But there are a few small variations that Mill introduces. And part of how he does that is, in this chapter, he answers possible objections to utilitarianism. And so that's the other main project of this chapter, is to consider the various things that people have said negatively about utilitarianism, the different kinds of criticisms that people have made, namely, that is, the objections to utilitarianism that people have presented, and then defending utilitarianism against those objections. So in chapter 2, we have, I count, 10 objections total presented to utilitarianism, which Mill recounts. He kind of just summarizes whatever that criticism is that people have made, and then he replies to those criticisms. Okay, so the whole chapter it's basically composed of Mill reporting on criticisms that have been made to utilitarianism and then replying to those criticisms and trying to defend utilitarianism against those criticisms. And Mill starts off the chapter with a definition of utilitarianism. And you'll notice that this is very similar to Bentham's definition. In fact, if you look at the two definitions side by side and you ask, what is different in Mill's definition from Bentham's? I think the answer, the only answer really that you can give is something like Mill's definition is a little bit clearer, or it's a little bit more direct about what is meant by different terms used in the definition, like happiness. So what Mill says is, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility. Okay, what he means by that is this is the creed that accepts utility as the foundation of morals, okay, or the greatest happiness principle. And so there he means, it's kind of an awkward sentence, but what he means is the creed that's represented in the greatest happiness principle, or the creed of the greatest happiness principle, accepts as the foundation of morals utility. Okay, it accepts utility as the foundation of morals. And now he's going to say more about what that creed says. So that whole first part up to principle is a long noun phrase that's just describing something. So that's the subject of the sentence. Okay, everything from the creed to principle is the subject of this long sentence. And then he's going to add a predicate to that and tell us something about that long noun phrase there at the beginning. This creed, he says, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And then he clarifies what's meant by happiness. He says, by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So again, if you compare this with Bentham's definition, I think you find that they're basically the same. So before going any further in the text, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background because Mill will refer to two previous ethical philosophies throughout the part of the text that we're reading. He'll refer to Epicurus and Epicureanism, and he'll refer to Stoicism and the Stoics. So these are traditionally opposed ethical philosophies that both became popular in the years after Aristotle, running up to about 400 AD. And each of them drew on parts of what Aristotle had said and then elaborated them in different ways. So the Epicureans counseled people to pursue pleasure and pain. They basically thought of happiness, the purpose of life or the best thing in life, as a matter of pleasure and pain, pleasure and avoiding pain. And they counseled people to try to have experience as much pleasure and as pleasurable a life as they could before they died. And so that was Epicureanism. One slight qualification that I need to make to that description is that the Epicureans recognized that a lot of things that are very pleasurable in the moment, like for instance drinking or sex or drug use and so on, are actually not the most pleasurable things in the long term, that they have serious painful consequences often. So the Epicureans didn't recommend drinking to excess. They recommended, or eating to excess, or copulating to excess, and so on. They recommended enjoying pleasures in moderation because that was the best way to maximize pleasure overall. So, and they also emphasized pleasures like the pleasure of learning, and they thought that was part of why they did philosophy and why they wrote books and talked about things. And they actually were very interested in theories of nature, sort of how nature works. So but they pursued these things as part of an overall pleasant and happy life. So that was their kind of ideal of the way that human beings should try to live. The Stoics, on the other hand, counseled people to not be concerned about pleasure or pain. They suggested that if we're concerned about our own pleasure or pain, then we're likely to sort of always be discontent because things may not go the way that we want them to go, and then we'll be upset. They suggested rather that we focus on doing what is right and avoiding doing what's wrong, regardless of the external circumstances. So they thought the best kind of life would be one that was steered by a kind of what you might call a moral compass that was consistent across all external circumstances. And it was that kind of self-control in the face of whatever happens externally that made one's life a good life. They didn't focus so much on happiness, but the best kind of life, they thought, and the most content kind of life would be one that wasn't just seeking pleasure and to avoid pain in these ways, but rather was trying to do the right thing. So you can think about them as kind of emphasizing the virtue side of Aristotle's ethical philosophy. And when Aristotle talks, for instance, about the person who engages in the right habits and has the right character traits will never fall below a certain level of misery, regardless of external circumstances. That's a very Stoic kind of idea. It's the kind of idea that the Stoics would end up emphasizing a lot later on. They would have these descriptions of people who were facing terrible external hardships, but by focusing on continuing to do the best that they could and the right thing, each day that came along and each situation that came along, they remained relatively content and could be proud of how they had behaved. And these were all, again, contributing to making their lives something noble, and that they that are the kinds of lives that we too should want to live. So, having described these two ethical philosophies, I could now ask you, which do you think utilitarianism is more like? Just from what you know this much about utilitarianism and about these two philosophies, do you think utilitarianism is more like Stoicism or more like Epicureanism? And why do you think that it's more like one or the other? I'll let you think about that yourself, and then I'll go on to just sort of say what Mill says about it, and maybe an answer will become clearer to you as we go. So the last point I want to make here is that, again, I count 10 objections in this chapter, and we're just going to look at 2 of them, okay? If you want to go on and read the rest of the chapter, it's interesting. If you find yourself very interested in utilitarianism, well, the whole chapter is there in your textbook. You can read it if you want, but I'm only assigning about, I think, 10 pages from the chapter that includes these 2 objections. So the first is what I call the swine-like objection, and the second is the happiness is not possible objection. And so what I'll do is in the next video, I'll basically talk through the swine-like objection and what Mill's replies are to that objection. And I'll leave you in your reading responses to basically summarize the not possible objection and the replies to it. Okay? So with that, I'll end this lecture and start again in the next one.